From empire to nation-state, the turbulent effect on religion, culture, and legislation during Japan's transition between imperial, military, and democratic rule. Hello, my name is Lisa Hollifield, and this is my final presentation for World History 370 Comparative Civilizations. My presentation deals with the history of Japan from feudal kingdom to modern nation-state and how the constant upheaval in leadership, as well as the influx of differing Eastern and Western ideologies, affected the legislative, cultural, and religious development of the country. Constant change in ruling authority had both a turbulent and transformative effect on Japan's cultural, religious, and legislative development. At one point, a land of warring barbaric tribes with a simple culture and no strong religious ties, the influence of China and Korea, Japan's militaristic ambition, as well as European and American imperialism, will leave an indelible mark on the development of the island nation. The influx of new religions and the unification of culture gave strength to a nation that was mired in the constant upheaval of shifting government, from feudal kingdom to imperial shogunate, and finally a modern nation-state. The themes and threads for my presentation are as follows. Religion, governmental organization, and cultural expression are a cornerstone of the development of Japanese heritage and tradition. But it is this clinging to tradition that ultimately led to the downfall of Japan as not only a feudal kingdom, but also a shogunate, and for a time, almost as a democratic nation-state. The influx of Eastern and Western cultural, religious, and legislative ideologies that directly influenced Japan's development from a feudal empire to a modern nation-state can be traced throughout Japanese history. And there are a great deal of complexities found therein. For the Japanese have formed their culture based mainly on outside influences, being that of Korea and Japan. They're a culture of clashes. They cling to their own traditions, but their own traditions did not take shape until they were able to bring in outside influences to give them structure. Once they had that structure, they left those outside influences behind and were able to come into their own as a distinct nation with their own legislation, artistic style, and cultural traditions. My discussion focuses primarily on Japan, but also includes references to China, Korea, Europe, and the United States, because of their influence on the development of Japanese culture, art, and religion during Japan's imperial and feudal eras, as well as European and United States influence, which had an important effect on the development of Japan as a modern competitive state on par with the major Allied powers. This is the outline that I will be referring to during my presentation, from Japanese prehistory, approximately 12,000 BC, all the way to the formation of the modern nation-state from 1945 to the present time. In prehistoric times, until about 400 AD, Japan was peopled mainly by small groups of tribes, the first of which were the Jomon. Now, the first indication of settlement on the islands of Japan was 12,000 years ago by these people, who were a race of hunter-gatherers that distinguished themselves by the fact that they were not nomadic in nature, but instead they were a sedentary people. Now, they did not have much of a legislative structure, and they had no written or pictorial language, but they did have a complex culture that is idealized in their corded pottery, which around 400 AD the Yayoi people would take advantage of once they migrated across the Korean land bridge and displaced the Jomon. The Yayoi, coming from across the Korean land bridge, were the first to bring outside influences of technology and early pictographic Japanese language. They brought with them the rudimentary use of bronze and iron for tools and weapons, as well as silk weaving and wood working, which would contribute to the move from the hunter-gatherer economy of old into the dependence on agriculture, which would pretty much rule Japanese society right up until the First World War. Once the Yayoi people died out, the Kofun era introduced the longest hereditary dynasty of emperors to date, as the Yayoi were primarily responsible for causing the Japanese legislative structure to coalesce from villages into kingdoms. Here's some photographic evidence of the corded pottery from the Jomon and metal Shinto bells from the Yayoi people. It's also important to note that during this time, the Shinto religion, which would eventually become the state religion of Japan, first came into existence at this time. Moving into classical Japan from 710 AD to 1185 AD, this is the first instance of the introduction of Buddhism into Japanese culture because of excursions into Korea. Buddhism was so influential in Japanese legislation and culture that the first ruling clan, the Soga, implemented a 17-article Confucian-inspired constitution because he believed that the rulers needed a specific belief system in order to rule by. They needed morals for government. It's at this point that there begins a clash between the indigenous Shinto religion and Buddhism, as which will be the religion, the most populous religion in the country. Buddhism seems to take over as it influences all the emperors to date, but Shinto still remains strong. As a result of this Buddhist influence, the next ruling clan, the Fujiwaras, implement the Taiho Code, which changes Japan from a nation of disparate kingdoms into a strong centralized government, what they refer to as the Ritsuryo state, with their imperial capital modeled after the Chinese Tang Dynasty capital of Chang'an. The Japanese capital is named HIWD. Here we have photographic evidence of the first ruling clan leader, the Soga, and the second ruling clan leader, Fujiwara. And now we move into medieval Japan with the rise of the shogunate from 1192 to 1600 AD. It's important to note that even though Chinese culture was highly influential at this time, that does not mean that Japanese culture wasn't flourishing on its own. For ironically enough, this is also a time of high art and the explosion of their own artistic and cultural style. Some of the most well-known pillars of Japanese culture that we know to today have been started during this time, namely Noah Theater, cultivating of flowers, cultivating of bonsai trees. At this time, Chinese influence begins to wane, as I said, leading to a period of high Japanese art and culture. So if you're wondering when the tea ceremony was first started, it was during this time, and it is a distinctly Japanese art form. This is also a well-known time period for the development of the Japanese written language, which may look like Chinese and Korean characters, but it is distinct. It's also noted for the decline of imperial power and the rise of the military shogun. At this point in time, because Shinto had become so influential, they had declared the emperor's line of descent by divine right, that basically saying that the emperor was related to the gods. This caused the influence of Buddhism to wane somewhat and Shinto to become stronger amongst the peasant class. The emperor was elevated into a position of religious authority, but not necessarily one of governmental power. As a result, most of the power went to the feudal lords, which moved Japan right into the age of the military shogunate. The land was nationalized, meaning that it was made available to everyone. But the only ones that could afford to own the land were the feudal lords. And so it coalesced on its own back into more of a feudal society under military rule. Since the feudal lords did not have to pay taxes, the army was not making any money. And as a result, the economy was going bankrupt. This is one of the things that you will find in Japanese history that tended to cause a problem. Every time one group would come into power, they would leave the economy to falter, and as a result, it would cause another upheaval. Since the military could no longer afford to be paid, the local lords decided to form their own private armies to protect their interests, called what we know as the samurai. The government became very much decentralized, and the power fell to these local feudal lords, who eventually became warlords or daimyos in charge of their own provinces. The shogunate, for the most part, let the local lords govern their territories as they wanted, and pretty much focus their attention on artistic and cultural pursuits instead, which left a distinct power vacuum. It's at this point that a very big change occurs in Japan as a Chinese vessel is blown off course and eventually lands in Tanegashima. This Chinese vessel, of course, was in 1543, was carrying a Jesuit priest from Portugal, and this is the first instance of a European setting foot on Japanese land, bringing not only Western ideology and technology, but also Christianity. And now we move into European imperialism and Christian expansion from 1543 to 1868. It's at this point that the capital moves permanently to Tokyo, ushering in 2 centuries of peace and stability from 1600 to 1868. At this point, Japan was a succession of warring states with no real unified structure. But upon the insurgence of Nobunaga, who was probably known to be the most revered shogun in Japanese history, he manages almost single-handedly before his death to unite the whole of Japan into one single country. Nobunaga was different than other shoguns for the fact that while past rulers would have preferred to close their doors to Eastern influence, Nobunaga was unique. He was very much interested in Western ideology, military tactics, and the technology that they could provide him to overcome his enemies. He actually welcomed them as well as Christianity. After Nobunaga dies, however, the successive shoguns completely changed everything that he has put in place. They completely eschew Christianity altogether and outlaw it entirely. They implement a closed-door policy, sukoku, to all Europeans except for a small island in which the Dutch were allowed to trade, as well as the Koreans and the Chinese, who they've been allied with for some time. Again, this is another instance of clinging to old ways and traditions, which would ultimately lead to the shogunate's downfall. When Western influences started to come into Japan, this is when a schism began to divide the people between Western and Eastern thought. And these people were starting to realize that maybe it might be wise for the Japanese government and for their culture to modernize in order to keep up with the way the world was starting to flow, which at that time was power was in the hands of the West. In order for Japan to be able to compete on that level, they were going to have to modernize. Unfortunately, the shoguns refused. They clung too much to their traditional ways. Because of this closed-door policy, trade sharply declined. Population declined. And yet, ironically enough, Japanese culture flourished once again. And this saw the preponderance of geisha houses, haiku poetry, and kabuki theater, which are main staples of Japanese culture to this day. It seems that no matter how much political upheaval Japan went through, their culture managed to flourish regardless. As the economy deteriorated further, the government went bankrupt. They could no longer afford to pay their army, and the peasants began to starve, which led to a great deal of civil unrest and quite a few instances of emperors attempting to overthrow the shogunate completely. Unfortunately, none of that worked. And it only caused the shogun to punish dissidents even worse, usually through boiling or being crucified on a cross. At this point, divisions begin to grow even more, as the Japanese peasantry and the poor are starting to see how hard it is for the country to keep going while clinging to its traditional ways. It would not be until 1853 and the arrival of Commodore Perry on a U.S. trading mission that would ultimately force Japan to open its doors to the Western world. Despite Japan's militaristic strength on land, they could not compete with Commodore Perry at sea, and as such were overrun and had no choice but to open their doors. This leads to new trade policies with the United States, Great Britain, Russia, and other Western countries. Here we have artist's depiction of Nobunaga and Japan as it was when he reunited it after the Warring States. This area in purple used to be divided up into different territories owned by feudal lords, but once he united the country, it came together as one, except of course for the Fujiwara North. Here we have some examples of Japanese culture, the tea ceremony and the Noa theater that managed to flourish despite the political upheavals, and an artist's rendition of Commodore Perry arriving on the Japanese shores, to the consternation of the Japanese people. Now, the samurai at this time were not at all pleased by the fact that the shogun seemed to be so open to Western thought and ideology. Now, a thing to note, it wasn't necessarily the samurai that lived in the cities. These were the samurai that lived in the countryside, the traditional ones, the ones whose loyalty was to the emperor alone. And they caused quite a bit of civil unrest. By 1877, they mount one last battle to try to retake Japan from Western influence, but they are completely crushed for the last time. This instance is what ushers Japan into the first beginnings of the country as a modern nation state. The emperor is completely restored to power, but the problem was Meiji was young and inexperienced. He was in a vulnerable spot, which made him easily pliable to be influenced by the samurai oligarchs who wanted Japan to be ruled their way. The ban on Christianity was lifted to strengthen ties with the West. The class system was also abolished, which brought the nobles and the peasants to more of an even keel. The Gregorian calendar was adopted, as well as Western clothing, hairstyles, literature, and science. This also, as a point of note, heralds in a time of massive industrialization. Meiji was desperate. The economy was in a bad state, and he knew that the only way for Japan to be on an even keel with the Western powers was for them to modernize at all costs. Therefore, agriculture had to stay in the countryside, and most people that could not afford to live on their farms anymore started moving into the cities to work in the factories, which led to a rapid urbanization. Shinto was declared the state religion, completely pushing Buddhism out, and the emperor was declared a living god. This is the first instances that even though Japan is not a military dictatorship, it was very close to becoming a semi-fascist state. The first prime minister is also elected, and a new constitution was promulgated in 1889, which is the first time that Japan at this point has a bicameral government divided between the House of Representatives and the House of Peers. We have an artist's rendition of Emperor Meiji and his final sublimation of the samurai amid Western influence. Those that did not appreciate the Western influence at all, and the fact that the poor only seemed to be getting poorer, led to a period of intense labor unrest and the spread of radical nationalism. Because Shinto was so strong at this point, this led to the Japanese believing that they were inherently superior than the rest of the Western world, even though they weren't entirely modernized as quickly as the United States or Europe was at this point. Also, because of their proximity to Russia and the fact that Russia itself was going through a political revolution, they caught on to the ideologies of communism, which spread rapidly through the working poor. Most of this radicalism and revolutionary thought had to be put on hold for World War I. And as a result of those gains, Japan was able to join the League of Nations. This rapid increase in the size of the Japanese army and their military capability put them on par with the United States as an emerging global power. Dissidence at this point was also punished, and political parties were completely abolished as the industry turned into corporate conglomerates, which were starting to hold all of the power within the country. They had an inherent distrust of the political parties and of the government itself. So the military, in league with the conglomerates, assassinated the leaders of the political parties and took over the government completely in 1936. When Hirohito came to power, this was the start of an extreme amount of Japanese ambition and, for some reason, the need for further expansion. They were so desperate to modernize and to be on par with the Allied powers that they decided the only way that they could do this was by using a show of force in invading Manchuria and French Indonesia. By doing so, they put themselves at a disadvantage with their allies and in the League of Nations, who had no choice but to implement economic sanctions against them for invading another country without permission. In response to these economic sanctions, Japan united with Germany and Italy in 1940 under the Tripartite Pact, which would take them into World War II. Again, an instance of military power not seeing how their dominance of the country was hindering the economy. And when the economy was hindered, instead of responding to that by backing off, they doubled down even further and caused the rest of the Western world to turn against them. During World War II, though Japan was initially allied with Germany and Italy, the military dictatorship of Emperor Hirohito essentially cut off all Japanese ties to the Western world. All they could think about at this time was military expansion completely and totally. They invaded the Philippines, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, and other countries, and also used a show of force in 1941 during their kamikaze attack on Pearl Harbor, which established them in the world's eyes as a military powerhouse. The U.S. forces were completely unprepared for these kamikaze attacks and had no idea how to deal with their suicide tactics. However, the Japanese land forces were no match for the U.S. naval forces at Saipan, the Solomon Islands, and the Battle of Midway, which was a turning point in World War II. At this point, Japan was on the verge of being invaded by U.S. forces and would have been, because of their unending need for expansion, had it not been for the atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which eventually led to their surrender in August of 1945. This is a picture of Hirohito along with the Japanese army in World War II. After World War II, Japan has firmly become a modern nation state. They are demilitarized, disarmed, and democratized in quick succession through the interim leadership of General MacArthur before a new prime minister is put in place. And while Shinto does remain the state religion, the emperor's claims to divinity are renounced completely, which does remove a great deal of power from not only the figurehead but the religion as a whole, which was a very large motivating factor in why they continue to want to expand. A new political constitution is established in 1947, which guarantees universal suffrage not only to men but women as well. And the new prime minister from there on out decides to focus Japan's growth on trade, industry, and for once, economic prosperity, which was a large part of the problem in the past for why Japan kept having so much economic upheaval. Even though their culture and their religious belief was strong, every time that they believed that they were on top, they forgot about those at the bottom. They let the economy wane for their own pursuits, which led to civil unrest, which led to further power grabs, and over and over and over again. Japan as a nation is thousands of years old and has always been a product of tradition. And it was that adherence to the past that gave them the strength to withstand invasion, but also sowed the seeds of discontent between those who believed that the old ways were best and those that knew that Japan must modernize in order to survive.